Hi, my name is Bill Creasy. I'm interested in the question of the, why do societies collapse? How fast can social life decline in a society, and how bad can things get? How can a society that provides for citizens for decades suddenly crash and stop working? Americans think that things like this couldn't happen here, but it's happened in other countries in the world, and there's no reason to think that Americans are immune. Americans aren't that different from other people. We go ahead doing what other people do, and we should start thinking about bad things that could happen to us. We aren't immune to the appeal from autocrats, for example. Um, so I think this is something that we should study and understand better. I like to talk about a book that gives a modern example of how these questions happen of the fall of society, and that is the case of Venezuela. And the title of the book gives the warning of what you can expect from it. And the title is Things Are Never So Bad That They Can't Get Worse. The book is written by a reporter named William Newman about recent history in Venezuela. He's a reporter who spent time there and interviewed people who live there. And it's during the past 3 decades when the society has had a catastrophic collapse and 20 to 30% of the population decided to leave the country. Venezuela went from a democratic country to a dictatorship. And at the same time, the economy crashed and there's severe inflation. Many people went to neighboring countries to get jobs, but a large number came into the United States. And of course, that got Trump's attention in the first term since he was trying to prevent immigration. But this happened very fast, and it was a very scary decline when you look at their recent history. For the most part, people living there had no say about it and had few options. But the most interesting question is what caused the country's society to crash so fast? So I'll give a quick survey of the Venezuelan history that came from the book and a few of my comments. I'm going to start with Hugo Chavez, who was elected, and then he became a dictator who took over the democracy. He's often been denigrated as a communist, but he was more of a populist who had political methods in common with Donald Trump. Chavez came to power in an election in 1998. He is described in this quote from the book. Chavez was deeply conservative in an essential way. His discourse was aimed at the past more than the future. It was about recapturing a golden age, returning to an imagined greatness that never really existed. End of quote. He constantly referred to Simon Bolivar, the liberator of several South American countries, as the past great leader, and Chavez wanted to return to Bolivar's past greatness. Chavez was a charismatic leader. Some of the citizens cheered when Chavez won in 1998. And here's a quote from the book. They were sick of inequality and corruption. Many people didn't have enough to eat while costs were soaring. They had lost faith in their leaders and in their political parties, and the empty promises of an oil boom gone bust in a democracy that seemed to serve only the elites. Someone had to take bold action and shake things up. So they elected Chavez to shake things up. And here's another quote. Chavez was inspired by the revolution in Cuba, antagonistic to the United States and its history of interventions in Latin America, and suffused with a vague notion of socialism and standing up for the downtrodden. End of quote. He was a socialist in a vague way, but he was not a really devoted ideological communist. for example, the way other dictators were. Again, Chavez spoke with great charisma. He was a populist in the sense that he responded to cheers and complaints of his audiences. Then he told them what they wanted to hear. The country had a lot of income from oil, so he was happy to spread the government money that came from oil around by giving discounted or free gasoline, appliances, and power to people. He used government money to give presents to his supporters. But he also had the support of rich elites. Here's a quote from the book. Chavez was backed by powerful people in the establishment, lending him airplanes for his campaign, giving him money, and ensuring that he received media attention. They thought he was someone that they could control if he pulled off the upset and won the election. End of quote. And he didn't win the election in 1998, and he governed until 2013 when he died of cancer. During that time, he spent a lot of money. Some of his big projects worked out, but other big projects turned into what they called holes in the ground. He had ideas for hospitals or housing that were funded, foundations were dug, but nothing was ever built because the money was stolen from corrupt officials. For example, the book discusses a show project of a commuter rail line, and it ended up not going anywhere. It was made to look like it worked as a campaign event. And unfortunately, the money that he spent wasn't necessarily from real income from oil, but it was money borrowed from banks using the oil as a collateral. And when the price of oil stopped going up, then the loans came due, and then there was a financial problem. But in 2013, Chavez's vice president, who's named Maduro, took over, and he was still president and dictator until Trump's army kidnapped him earlier in 2026. Maduro wasn't as charismatic as Chavez was, but he allowed the corruption of the elite upper classes to continue, and he kept control of the military. He lost the elections, but stayed in power. And here's another quote from the book. Maduro had inherited from Chavez a government stripped of checks and balances without a separation of powers. Chavez had filled the Supreme Court with loyalists, and they reliably ruled in favor of the government. Judges at other levels were kept in line. For years, the legislature was a rubber stamp with a tame Chavez majority. They also controlled the electoral council, allowing them to set rules and conditions that suited them. As the price of oil went down, government funding dried up, and the big giveaways stopped. Chavez's big giveaway programs and the public works projects went away. And also, inflation started rising by almost unimaginable amounts. And a problem that the Venezuelans had that contributed to this, and that Americans haven't had to deal with, is the problem of financial exchange rates. The book describes a very simple kind of common corruption that happened. There was a large difference between the official government exchange rate from dollars to Venezuelan bolivars, and between that and the black market exchange rate. As a result, it was possible to get dollars from the government, for example, for imports, but then sell the dollars on the black market and make a profit at it without even doing any importing. So people made money at the expense of the government, and inflation was driven up. The exchange rate of bolivars decreased by a factor of a billion with a B over 10 years, and everything constantly rose in price until nothing was affordable. So the money would be worth less in the morning than it was the night before, literally. An event in the book that the book revisits repeatedly was the problem of an electric grid blackout that happened over the entire country. It started on a Thursday afternoon, March 7th, 2019, and it lasted about 5 days. This may have been a crucial event in the collapse, or it may have just been an example of the general decline of the infrastructure. Power went off over the entire country for many days. For the first few days, of course, it wasn't too bad. People ate preserved or frozen food before it spoiled. But after that, food quickly became scarce and hard to find. Looting became common. And the book describes how a hotel was completely stripped of everything, including wires and pipes, while the owners just stood and watched, and with no way to stop the looters and no enforcement by the police. So the book also talks about 4 retired engineers who were rehired to restart the electric generators after the blackout. And what they found was that the generators were totally neglected, and there was no effort to maintain them. Here's a quote from the book. About the blackout, Maduro was claiming sabotage and outside aggression, but other people were pointing to what everyone knew to be true. For years, Venezuela's electrical system had been decaying, suffering from massive disinvestment and a failure to maintain its installations. Like virtually everything else in the country, it was falling apart. So when you're looking at the collapse of the society, this is a part of the story that it's hard for an outsider to understand, and it's hard to wrap your head around about the fall of society. It's hard to see the effect of things that aren't being done when people lose interest and they stop doing the routine maintenance. For example, it's normal and understandable for a few people to sit around an office and slack off once in a while. But when everybody in the society does that, it's a disaster. And unfortunately, in this society, there were clearly no regulators who had any power to enforce rules to maintain the standards. People were only looking to steal money through corruption and keep it for themselves. By now, what has resulted is that there is an elite with lots of money in dollars who live in luxury and look out for themselves. But there's a huge underclass that can barely afford any food or shelter. And even if they have jobs, they aren't paid enough after inflation that the money is worth anything. So again, this may appear that the situation was similar before Chavez. People have the same complaints, but in reality, it's now far worse. Because before Chavez, poor people could afford a decent meal for their family. But after Maduro got done, people had trouble getting even rice and lentils, the bare minimum, cheapest foods. And sometimes they missed meals. So things got worse more than anybody could have imagined before they elected Chavez to shake things up. And as a result of the collapsing economy, people left the country in huge numbers. There are very few cases in history where 20 to 30% of the population leaves. Most of them went to other South American countries looking for jobs. For example, Colombia, that's next door. And some came all the way to the United States. And again, Trump, who was trying to stop immigration, got upset about that. And Trump then started economic sanctions against Venezuela, and that may have helped to make things worse, but certainly weren't the key parts of the problem. And it's interesting that the book describes that even a poor woman who was living in the slums had more common sense about the economy than the leaders did, which is a little paradoxical. Newman, the author, interviewed a woman named Hilda, who was a poor woman living in a shack in the slum section of the city. She was also worse off after Maduro than she was before Chavez got in. And Hilda was quoted as saying, quote, "There shouldn't be either too much capitalism or too much socialism," she said. "If there's no business, how are you going to work? And if you don't work, how are you going to buy things?" But you also don't want a country that has too much poverty. That's no good. A country that doesn't progress, a country where people can't get ahead. I think there has to be a balance, socialism and capitalism, because they go hand in hand, end quote. So it seems like she understood how an economy should work better than the leaders of Venezuela did. So in summary, there's no question that Venezuela is worse off now than it was before Chavez. Venezuela's economy was too dependent on income from oil, for one thing, and population became dependent on cheap goods from the government. Chavez was a charismatic populist leader who was elected in several elections, and he at least listened to the people if he wasn't a responsible leader for leading the economy. But after him, Maduro took over, and he was even less competent. And from people in the United States, the resemblance to Trump and what is doing to the government of the United States is a little unsettling. Chavez consolidated his personal control over the media and the military. And it's interesting and troubling that after Chavez died, Maduro managed to hold on to power in spite of the challenges and the lost elections up to the present time. The old democratic system didn't come back after Chavez left, and Maduro managed to maintain his place in the dictatorship. In some ways, this story is a little unsatisfying as a way of understanding the collapse of society because it doesn't explain exactly what went wrong. What was the fatal flaw or the chink in the armor that caused the society to collapse? And it appears that Maduro was a terrible administrator, and also he had no charisma, so he didn't inspire people. But the population of the country lost the will to work when their wages became worthless. And the people who were on the losing end of the corruption were losing out. And the people began to neglect maintenance of the infrastructure. They thought only of themselves, and they just allowed the social system to crumble. So we have to wonder whether the same thing could happen to the United States. Can Trump assert enough control over government and then pass control to a successor that no one can oppose him, as happened in Venezuela? It's hard to say it won't happen here. Societies can be more fragile than they appear. And if people stop working together to do their parts to run society, it can grind to a halt. There's nothing magical about it. And as another aside, the opposition leader in Venezuela, Maria Corina Machado, just got a Nobel Peace Prize. She isn't mentioned in the book, which ends around 2020, but opposition to her and others hasn't restored the democracy or a sound economic system. And in fact, when Trump took Maduro out, he left the existing political system in place. So even if Maduro isn't in charge anymore, the rest of the government is still there. And as the book title says, it's never so bad that it can't get worse. So we'll have to watch and see what happens next. Thank you.